So today I'd like to show you how to use this special ruler for a traditional patchwork block known as the Dresden plate block. It is very easy to sew it with this special ruler. This ruler is known as the Easy Dresden ruler. As its name states, it really makes the sewing of this block very easy. There are a series of lines on this ruler. You can see that they go from 1 inch up to 8 inches. 8 inches actually is with seam allowance. So I guess the longest blade that you would be able to make here is about 7 inches long. So this ruler can be used to sew the Dresden plate block both by hand or by machine. So how do we do this? For this design, you can cut all of the pieces from one piece of fabric or from an assortment of fabrics. You can combine them any way you want. For this exercise, I am going to use 5 different fabrics. We need 20 blades altogether. This means that I need to cut 4 blades from each of these fabrics. So how to do this? To start, I've decided to cut my pieces, my blades, at a 4-inch length. So I already have a strip of fabric that has been cut at 4 inches. If I'm going to sew by hand, what I need to do is to place the ruler on the fabric, lining up the edges, the raw edges of my 4-inch strip. So here I have the ruler lined up and then the 4-inch line on the other side. And I'm going to draw. It can be with a fabric marker, or here I'm just using a pencil, a mechanical pencil, and I will just draw those 2 lines on either side of the ruler. And so here I have the first piece ready, the first blade ready. To save fabric, I'm going to turn the ruler around, align it with a drawn line, and align it also once again with the edges of the strips. And so I would continue to rotate the ruler and turn it around until I have the number of blades that I want to use. And then I could cut this with scissors. This is if I am doing hand sewing, and if I don't have a rotary cutter and mat. So here I'm just cutting along the lines that I have drawn. Okay, so this is the way to use the ruler if I don't have a mat and a rotary cutter. So this can be done by hand. But if I do have a mat and rotary cutter, the other way to do this is in the same way by placing the ruler on the strip of fabric, aligning the edges, and instead of drawing the line, I simply would cut it with the rotary cutter. And so there we have the blade. So turning the ruler around, aligning it along the cut edge and along the edges, the raw edges of the strip, and then just cutting the different blades. Okay, so in my case, from each fabric, I will be cutting 4 blades. How to sew them now? Okay, so if you are sewing by hand, what you want to do is we're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance along the top edge. We fold that edge in half and we will sew here with a seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch. It turns out that the ruler has a seam allowance of 1/4 of an inch. You see the dotted line here? And that is exactly 1/4 of an inch. So you can use that measurement for your seam allowance. So what we would do is then put that dotted line on the raw edge of the blade, aligning it well, and then draw the sewing line Once again, this is if you are going to be sewing by hand. So fold it in half, right sides together. I always do a little back stitch when I start my sewing. And then a running stitch. Every now and then I like to do a little back stitch to hold the thread in place until I reach the end of the sewing line. And at the end I just finish off with a little knot. So even doing this by hand means that you can sew these blades very quickly. And then I just kind of lose the thread within the seam allowance. Okay, so this is the way to do this by for hand sewing. And so we'll turn it inside out, and you can use a turner, or you can use the tips of your scissors. It's better if you use blunt edge scissors to poke that tip out. And there we have our blade ready to be joined to the other ones. Okay. So you would press this with the iron. And that is the way we will sew all of the blades then. Okay, so once again, this is the way to do it if you are sewing by hand. But let's see what we do if we're sewing on the machine. Sewing by machine is exactly the same. The difference is that we don't need to mark the blades because the sewing machine usually has your seam allowance already, either using the foot of the machine or it's already on the machine itself, on the bed of the machine. So here we just simply sew with that a quarter of a seam allowance, and I can keep just putting the 20 pieces in one after another until I've sewn them all together. So it's a very fast process. Okay, so here we have the 20 blades already sewn and turned inside out. Now it's time to join them. So I will just alternate the different fabrics. And once again then, to sew this by hand, what we can do is to trace the seam allowance using the line on the ruler itself. So I would once again be aligning the dotted line along the raw edge of the blade and marking it either with a fabric marker or a pencil. And then I would simply put the two blades together, right sides together. And what I would recommend is that you start joining from the fold itself, because if the fabric moves by any chance, if there's going to be any difference, it is better that it's down at the end of the blades because those will be covered by the circle. So it's always better to start along the folded down edge. So once again, if we're going to do this by hand, you just sew along the line. If it's going to be on the sewing machine, then you just use the line on the sewing machine for that quarter of an inch seam. So here we'll just join all of the pieces, all of the blades in whatever order you like. until we complete the circle. That's what I'm going to do now, and then I'll come back so you can see the finished circle. Here we have all of the pieces that have already been joined. This is our traditional Dresden plate. And so here we would have to decide then how to use this piece. Usually this goes into a block for a quilt, which is what I'm going to do with my Dresden plate block here. So I have folded this down diagonally so that I can find the center. So I have these placement lines really. And so I'm going to center the plate on the block. I'm going to make sure that I'm using these lines to center the block using the seam allowance, the seam lines. So I have 5 here, and then I have 5 more over here between each folded line. So what to do with the middle point, this circle here? If we're using this ruler, we'll need a 3-inch circle regardless of whatever length our blade is, because it will be the same size for any of the blades that we've cut. So in that case, what I do is I have used a thick cardstock, and you can use you can either draw a 3-inch circle on it, or you can use a lid to draw the line. So just find something that you make sure will be covering the seam allowances. So I'm using this lid to draw my circle on this thick cardstock. So it's very sturdy. So draw the circle around it and cut it out. I have one that I've already prepared here. And I have also drawn and cut a circle out of fabric with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So it's a little bit bigger than the cardstock circle. What I'm going to do then with this is I'm going to do like a running stitch, a long stitch along the whole edge of the circle. It's pretty much a gathering stitch. Okay, so once I have stitched along the whole seam, I'm going to place the cardstock circle within the fabric circle. I'm going to pull on this edges so that I can gather the fabric around the cardstock circle. And then to make sure that the edges are turned under well, then I will iron this down. And for this, I really do prefer using a steam iron. I'm being careful not to distort the cardstock, but I find that the steam really does help to fold the edges down well. So I iron on both sides, and I try to make sure that there's no little points, that I've got the fabric really tight against the edge of the circle. Once it's ironed, then I can take the cardstock circle out. And if you want, then you can give it another quick press, just to make sure that all of the edges have been turned under. Okay, so once this is done, then I can center it on that open space on my Dresden plate, and I would then applique this down, and that way I'm covering all the seam allowance of the blades. So I will just use a couple of pins to hold this down. So here you have to decide if you want to applique the circle by hand or on the machine. Okay, so if you are familiar with applique, then actually I had some thread left over here, so I'm going to use the same thread, it's the same color thread, to applique this circle by hand. And I will just do this with an invisible stitch. So just remember that the invisible stitch means that you go down into the background fabric, or in this case the blade and the background fabric. Come up a little bit ahead of that and through the edge of the circle, and that's all. So just not big stitches, but they don't have to be that tiny either. And just try to be uniform in the size of the stitches that you take. So this is the way we would applique this by hand. And that way it would be an invisible applique. Now if you want to do this by machine, it would pretty much depend on the stitches that your machine has. Some machines have a very specific stitch for applique, but you can use a buttonhole stitch if your machine has this. I have another sample here to show you what I like to do when I do it on the machine. I like to use decorative stitches on some of my applique pieces like this one. So here I have used a decorative stitch to attach my circle. And then for the edges, I have used a special stitch which goes like 3 stitches down and then 1 in, a bite in. And here you can see it on the back. And this is the way I have attached the whole plate to my background black. So this is the way to use the ruler, this Easy Dresden ruler, for the traditional Dresden plate block. So here I have both of my blocks already finished. One has been appliqued by hand, the other one has been appliqued on the machine. Here I have another block. It's a smaller one, so you can compare. This was done with 2.5 inch blade, but you can see that the circle is the same size. And here I have used another decorative stitch to applique the circle down. So what's nice about this ruler is that it makes it really easy to cut the blades for this particular Dresden plate block. However, you can also use this ruler for other blocks. So let's see what else we can do with this ruler. So remember that we cut a whole bunch of blades, right? So for our Dresden plate block, what we did was we folded this edge down to make those points, but what we can do is to not make those points and simply join the pieces. Sorry, this goes around like this. So join the blades in a circle with the wider part towards the outside. Okay, so then we form a circle. There is a traditional block known as the grandmother's fan block, and it is sewn like this. The grandmother's fan block usually is 1/4 of a circle. So since we have cut, we cut 20 pieces, 20 blades for the Dresden plate block. So for this one, we would be cutting 5. And the corner would be 1/4 of a circle. Now here you do need to take into account that this circle has to be larger than the Dresden plate block circle because we have a seam allowance here. So I think that for this circle, I cut the fourth of a 4-inch circle. In any case, this is another way to use the ruler, cutting our blades and sewing them together to give us this fourth of a circle. And then this can be joined with others, alternating and rotating the blocks within a quilt. Let's see some of the examples. Okay, something else that we can do with this ruler, and the same, I'm cutting the blades in the same way, any length that you want. If this is the way we put them down to make a semicircle or circle, the other way to do is alternating the blades in rows. So the first piece, if the wider part is towards the bottom, then the second piece, the wider part of the blade would be on the top. So we would be alternating with the different widths. And then this would give us a different type of design. So here we would have some strips, which we can continue to join also for in a quilt. The second row would be like this. So you see how we would end up with kind of an interesting design. And in the end, these are strips. This is a design known traditionally also as a tumbler block because of the shape, in the shape of a tumbler of a glass. So this can be arranged in different ways also, but this is the most traditional way to do it, that is joining them in strips. Okay, here there's an additional use for this little ruler that I like to do a lot. So on the edge of some of my projects, I like to add these little prairie points. It can be for a little wall hanging or a table runner. And this we do it in the exact same way that we did the Dresden plate blocks, but in this case, I cut my blades 1 inch long. So using the same ruler, but cutting them at 1 inch. So I've done it the exact same way, right? I mean, sewing the right sides together along the widest part and using that fourth of an inch seam allowance and then turning it around. And so then I have these little points like this. So if we turn it around, we can see that it is a scant 1/4 of an inch right here, which means that right along the edge of the folded part of the point, if we put this along the edge of our project, we can then stitch it down, top stitch it here to hold down all those little points. And then we have this decorative element in our project. So as you can see, even though it looks like a very simple ruler, it has multiple uses. And so I find that this is very, very versatile. I really, really like this ruler a lot. As we've seen, we have 4 different techniques here. So I encourage you to experiment a little bit with this ruler and cut the different sizes, play around with it, play with your favorite fabrics, and just enjoy, have fun working with this ruler. I hope this little tutorial has been useful for you. Thank you for watching.